All right. Well, today on the show, we are excited to have Donnie Griggs with us today. Donnie, how are you?
I'm doing okay, man. A little tired, but I'm doing all right.
Yeah. Donnie, it's so good to talk to you. And Donnie, so much of your work focuses on small towns, and you've written the book "Small Town Jesus." I'd love to hear a little bit of your story. Just introduce yourself to our audience.
Yeah, sure. So I'm leading the church that my wife and I started 12 years ago in a little living room in my hometown. And it's a small town in coastal North Carolina. There's a book about our town, and my mom, as a little girl, my granddad are on the cover. And so this is very much my town, very much my community. But when I was graduated high school, I moved away for about 10 years, did a bunch of mission trips overseas, discovered church planning, and really felt like I was going to end up in, I think like most people did, certainly that at that, sort of time period, late 2000s, I just assumed I was going to some big city somewhere in the world. And so was really, engaged on that thinking and already thinking through where I'd go and all the rest. And then on a random trip back here to my hometown, my wife and I I ran into a bunch of my friends from growing up, and they were, a lot of them were in a really hard, sad, dark place, and so God just broke our heart. And a few months later, we found ourselves here. We didn't have any money. I think we got given $800 to go plant a church. Flipped our car on the way out here, so we didn't even have a car. And just showed up with nothing on a Friday night and started in a living room on a Sunday morning. And so, 12 years later, our church now it's got 4 locations. It's 4 kind of small towns around our area. And very involved in the community. The reason I'm tired, I'm a chaplain for kind of our area too. And I got called out. 911 center called me last night. There was a individual who wanted to go get some help, bad off on heroin. And so it's been a long night, but that's kind of par for the course for a lot of us in small towns,
Yeah. What has that been like planting your church in your hometown? What's that been like?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's got some real ups and some real downs. I think so. I mean, small towns can tend to be really hostile towards outsiders. And so I think being indigenous is a huge advantage in that way, because I know all these people. And if I don't know them, I know their mom, their dad, or their cousin or somebody. I feel like I feel like I know the culture. I speak the language. I mean, the humor, everything, like all those kind of like colloquialisms and all that stuff that, you take for granted growing up in a small town. And we have seen how people from other places come in, and it's a real adjustment, especially if they're coming in from a suburban or an urban area. It can be really tough, to understand culture. It can take a long time. To be trusted by the community takes forever, feels like. And so I think it's a huge advantage, and I'm a huge proponent of guys going back and doing ministry in their hometowns. I mean, I've written on that stuff for TGC and other publications, and I've coached a lot of guys who've done that. There are challenges, and that is that you can get that, like some of that like animosity that like, you see like with Jesus's small town, like, oh, who's this guy? We know who his dad, is, and who, that whole like, your sort of like past can haunt you. It's easy to dismiss you as just being, this kid who everybody knew growing up. I mean, that stuff does happen. And I think the biggest challenge that I would say is that when people leave, it can hurt really bad, because they're not just, I remember hearing guys say to me, like I'd go to church planting conferences, and, people would talk about how like when people leave your church, oh, it's just kind of like, it just happens and done. They just talk very nonchalant about it. I'm like, yeah, but like, what if you went to scouts with those people? Like, what if that's like where you did sleepovers all growing up? Like, it's just hard to express how much it hurts when you've got decades of relationship there. And so, it's got ups and downs. I think the pros outweigh the cons, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we planted our church in the church where in the town rather where I'm from 10 years ago in Hazard, Kentucky. And so small town, I get it, man. I would love to hear. It is hard. It is hard. You get attached to people and you've had these relationships before even you started your church. I would love to hear, how do you cope with that? What are some ways that you kind of walk
Mhm.
through that?
Yeah, I think I didn't do so well originally.
Mm,
I was arrogant. I didn't think if I was ever going to leave. That's so stupid. Um, but what you don't have the ability to do is get away from each other. You know, they don't want to be around you either, you know. Like, you only got one Walmart, you know, like and so I just nobody, I mean, that was the thing, like, because there wasn't like this, like, there wasn't a lot of resources, you know, when I planted
yeah.
into this small town for urban or for like rural small town stuff. And so and I just, you know, I wasn't prepared for that. Like, okay, now they've left church on Sunday, but you're going to see them probably Monday, Thursday, Friday. You know, so you'll see them. You know, you guys will see each other, and I just, you know, I was just immature, and I got really hurt. And I don't think it's like wrong to be hurt. I think that's just a natural thing. I think if you love people and you're doing church right, it's going to hurt when things go a different way. You know, I think that's a good sign. I don't want to be calloused about people leaving, but I do think I was immature in a lot of ways. I think, you know, I did what you do when you feel hurt or betrayed. You kind of, you know, you play the victim and all the rest. And I did some of that. I mean, just being candidly honest. And um, I think what I've learned through the years is, you know, not to do that, and to just be as kind and gracious as I can be when people leave for even reasons that I don't really understand, or do things that I really don't understand. I try to be as kind and gracious as I can. I try to engage. I intentionally engage them when I see them in public, which is all the time. And I'll tell you something, Mark. Nobody told me this, but if you stick around long enough, um, sometimes those people come back.
Hmm.
And I did not realize that was a thing. And I was actually we had a couple over last night, that the guys on the track to be an elder in our church, and they had really been hurt and had offended, and we had tried very hard to help them, and I think we could have done a lot of things better. But they left, and they were like one of those families that when they left, they just left a huge hole in the church and in your heart. Um, and then several years later, they showed back up on a Sunday. I mean, I was like
Hmm.
overcome with emotion. And now the guys, you know, on track to become an elder here. I just didn't know that was possible either. And I think if you know that, you know, one, whether they come back or not, you can be kind and gracious. You can sort of play that, like you can take the higher road as you see them in community and all the rest. But then two, there's a possibility those people might end up back in your church. And um, so, yeah, I don't know. That's kind of how I've tried to handle it.
That's a strong word. Can you give us a sense of the size of your town? So what's the population?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question too. So when we say small towns, what I've found through the last several years since I wrote the book is it's like different than in a city where we're all competing about who's got the biggest city and the best restaurants. In a small town, we're competing about whose town is the smallest. And so, I mean, our town is 9,000, and some people go, "Oh my gosh, that's not a small town. You might as well be Manhattan." And some people are like, "Oh, well, my small town is 40,000 people or whatever."
Yeah.
So we are kind of the larger town in our area. We're surrounded by a bunch of little islands and stuff, like coastal North Carolina.
Okay.
So we work into a bunch of communities that are like, you know, there's an island here called Davis. It's got a couple hundred people living on it, and everybody I know from Davis, their last name is Davis. And there's a guy in our church who's a leader who goes by Davis from Davis. So I would
That's
tell
great.
people, I think that gives me some small town credibility. I mean, yeah. So we're a tourist destination. So you know, small towns kind of like, I guess, Lake of the Ozarks or Aspen. These are towns you know about, but they're really small towns. But certain times of the year they just explode. That's what happens to us in the summer. Everybody comes here, and it's good for our economy. But yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things, you know, obviously you hear a lot of talk this past year, with all the challenges pastors face, COVID and just everything that's happened. What have been just some of the particular challenges that you've
Mhm.
walked through,
Mm.
that you've
Ah,
found challenging?
yeah, man. I think I mean, it's tough for everybody, I think if I was in an urban setting, I would have my own, like, I would be saying it was just as hard. I'd be saying it maybe from a different angle. I imagine that a lot of us in small towns felt the political side of things more
Mhm.
than folks in urban centers where you know it was more straightforward. Bigger numbers of outbreaks and all the rest. I mean, I think it was very hard. We've tried to walk a line, through the years of, I mean, a lot of times churches in rural America are basically like, hey, on Sunday, you're going to hear what you could have heard on Fox News, like last night.
Mhm.
Um, I've seen some of that, like growing up and being in small towns and all the rest. And we've tried to you know, not do that. We've tried to hold out Jesus every week but it just felt like no matter what we did, it was going to come across as political some way or another, and that it was going to really offend, one major group of the church or another. And that was really hard. It's like,
Mhm.
you take a side, like we had to go online for 5 months and had to figure out what live stream was and had to wonder where all these people in our church were. And like, take aside all that just to like knowing that like whatever decision you made, um, you felt like was going to be wrong. And nothing, no amount of like face-to-face conversations was going to seem to like, you know, um, help people who were just convinced that you were on some political agenda. I mean, I remember the first Sunday we were able to meet back in person, and it was only because a federal judge in North Carolina made it where churches could meet back in person. So we did so, but we did so with masks and, people spreading out. I mean, we got a tiny little hospital here. I mean, our church could have likely overwhelmed the healthcare system in 1 week. I mean, that didn't feel like a very missional thing to do. And so we were trying to do our best, but I was excited. I was like, man, this is great. We finally meeting after 5 months. And I jumped on Facebook and was like, from our church, and said I was part of a liberal conspiracy to destroy America. And people started piling in going, yeah. And I was like, geez, like, I just didn't see that coming, And so I think
Uh-huh.
that like that grind of like, and then you're seeing that you're having everywhere I went in town for all this time, every single place I went for the last 14 months, every grocery store, everything, every time somebody would come up and say, hey, we're ready for those masks to be done on Sundays and we'll come back. When are you going to take away those masks? Like, it's just a grind. And then added to that, Mark, I mean, it's not like people stop sinning and marriages stop falling apart, people stop getting cancer and kids
Hmm.
stop dying. I mean, we had the most brutal pastoral year I've ever encountered.
Hmm.
And in this like season where we're all just, I bet there's a lot of us, listening to this who probably have similar stories. You just feel like, now there's this pressure to do something new and plan something new and start something new. And I'm hearing about like denominations going, what's next? And let's plan and let's do it. And I reckon a bunch of us are just daggone exhausted.
Hmm.
Like, so yeah.
Yeah. And so you were closed for 5 months,
Yeah.
and I'm
Well,
not
we
really,
do a camera,
yeah.
we did everything online,
Mhm.
made tons of phone calls to, all the folks in our church and tried to just do what we could. But yeah, couldn't meet in person for 5 months.
Where are the restrictions? I know in Kentucky in a couple of weeks, I think in two actually, all of the restrictions will basically go away.
Hmm.
Where's North Carolina with that?
Yeah. So a few weeks ago, it was changed where you didn't have to wear a mask if you were fully vaccinated in public. Um, and in a lot of like, that was indoor spaces as well. And they changed the indoor capacity on a lot of like event spaces, made it a lot bigger. So, I mean, again, because of what that federal judge did last summer, we could have been meeting without mask and everybody sitting on top of each other ever since then. And, maybe there'll be a section in heaven where everyone, mocks those of us who still spread out, put masks on. I mean, we're just doing, you're just doing the best you can, everybody's doing the best they can. But so we could have officially, based on that, done whatever we wanted, I guess since last summer, but we've tried to like be a little bit more conservative, just the size of our hospital. And really we've spent, I guess that's a point, is that I've taken a lot of my cues from our local healthcare workers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I feel like you can talk all day about what the CDC says or what this news channel says. I don't know what to believe on all that. I'm not some scientist. I'm not some doctor, but I do have a working relationship with our local healthcare, our doctors, ER staff, and first responders. We've spent every decision we made, we ran through them. And I wanted to feel like we were doing good by them. They're the ones who are going to bear the brunt if we, take a different route. And so, rightfully and wrongfully, but I think now, to answer your question, more and more, it's kind of you can do whatever you want. And so we are still having a socially distanced section in our, in each of our locations. There's a socially distanced section where you have to wear a mask and spread out. And we, and I think probably what, one of the things we're really trying to do is keep an attitude of kindness towards those who are still wearing masks. I mean, I'm sure you're finding this, but if you're still wearing one by now, it's not really that simple. It's not like, oh, you're a lib or a dim or whatever, that sort of language is. I mean, we're seeing it's like, well, actually my daughter's got this autoimmune, issue, or my mom just found out she has cancer, or, I mean, there's like real issues. I mean, someone lost their spouse to COVID, and they just can't seem to take that mask off yet. There's just trauma there. And so, we've tried to model kindness. So all of our staff and our elders and our volunteers will have a mask in our pocket. And if someone's wearing a mask, we'll put it on before we engage them. And we've asked people in our church to do the same, not just at church, but in the community. Like, guys, let's go out of our way to be kind, and so, yeah.
Yeah. So you've been obviously back having in-person services for a while. I know when a lot of people were in the online only phase, there was this idea that once we open back up, there's just going to be a rush back.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't seem to be the majority of the case for most people that you talk to.
Yeah.
And so here we are, seemingly on getting close to, at least hopefully, on the other side of it.
Yeah.
How has that been like for you? Have you seen more and more people come back? And
yeah,
what's your thinking there? How are you trying to navigate that? People that maybe used to come and you don't know. Yeah,
that's a good question. All right, so I'd love to hear if you've kind of engaged with other small town rural guys who are seeing still like a lot of people at home, like watching or something online. That dropped off significant for us. I mean, it was like really, the numbers of people watching were like a fraction of what used to be in attendance. I mean, and I we've tried through the years too to like incorporate video, and I've just found it to be a real struggle. It just doesn't seem to take that naturally, at least in our small town rural context. And I know a lot of guys it's the same. And I know guys who've had the opposite experience. They've had, but we have just struggled here with getting people to watch something from home. And so I think people went like a year or more without watching anything, without doing anything, that's its own separate issue, right? That we can talk about in a second. But we have definitely started seeing people come back. Every Sunday, there are people coming back who like I haven't seen in 14, 15 months. And so, and I think we grew in over COVID as well, which is kind of an interesting dynamic. There were people who joined us, who found us in the middle of like, you had to show up and sit 6 feet apart and wear a mask, and what a terrible time to join a church. And it happened. And so we're in that dynamic. We're starting to see some people come back. Definitely not everyone, but we're definitely seeing more and more each week. So I imagine that'll continue. And you said something a second ago that I think is really interesting. Is like the engagement. What's the engagement like with folks who haven't been around for 14 months? And what if those people were leaders, and that's going to be what I'm nervous of, is creating a bit of a class system, within the church. I mean, you look at like Ephesus and Corinth. I mean, the way that like they fought for a kind of unity that was just different in the world. I mean, I think we need that more than ever. And so I'm really leaning in, trying hard to like help us avoid that. And I'm just being candid. I mean, I'm guessing this leaders listening to this. I've been thinking a lot about the parable of the prodigal son. And, you know, when that kid comes back, the dad doesn't go, well, okay, so you're back. I guess you're back now because you need some money. You know, like I would imagine like the attitude of being, well, I guess you're back now since you don't have to wear a mask. You know, I just think, man, nobody was prepared for what we all just went through. And so I think we've got to find ways to like extend as much grace and kindness to each other as possible as we all come out of this, you know?
Yeah, that's a good word. Yeah, that's a good word. As you talk to other small town leaders in different parts of the country or the world, what are some of the challenges that they're talking about that they're facing right now?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest thing a lot of us are facing is just this, at least in the American front, but not even really in the American front. I think, you know, a lot of my guys, you know, that I work with in the UK are experiencing the same thing. But, you know, COVID really wasn't the big story. It was the political stuff. That was the big story.
Yeah.
You know, it was, you know, in our country, it was what happened with, you know, Black Lives Matter, you know, and Antifa and Proud Boys and QAnon, and that's the big story, you know. I mean, really, if it had just been COVID, gosh, that would have been a lot easier. You know, if it had just been straightforward, it's a health crisis, let's all do our best here. But that's not what it was, you know. And it was that tsunami of like just impossible situations to navigate. And so I do think, like I said earlier, I think all of us feel really exhausted. And then I think there's probably a fair amount of paranoia. You know, like I think a lot of us can see that politics on either side has taken too much of a seat in the hearts of a lot of the people that we love and care about in our church. And I mean, it was a perfect storm for that. I mean, you're stuck at home. You've got nothing to do but be online or watch cable news for hours and hours and hours. You're isolated. And there's all these things that make you afraid or worried or whatever. So I can definitely see how it happens. But I think that's probably like one of the common threads I find, like talking to small town guys, is the sense in which we want to figure out can we be I use this word, like a prophetic voice. Like how can we like speak that cutting sort of like truth of the gospel into this moment, but in a way where we don't, like, everyone doesn't just like, I mean, if possible, how do we do that without everyone tuning us out, you know? And like, you know, I mean, I've literally had guys going like, man, I want to say something. I don't want to lose my job, you know? And so I think we all feel like a burden, like, gosh, guys, I think we could all admit here that somehow, some way, this stuff became too important if we really say Jesus is what matters most, you know? But how do you now lead through that? How do you lead people out of that is a real challenge. You know, how do we get people back to a point where Jesus is the most important name, you know, and his kingdom is more important than, even, you know, things like wanting our country to be great. I mean, you know, we are distinct people, you know, we're nomads, we're strangers, we're exiles on the earth, you know, and so I think that's a real challenge for a lot of us, is how do we lead back to that? How do we help? Yeah, how do we help people who say that Jesus is their Lord and King? How do we help them? How do we help their lives really resemble that? You know, so
yeah, I love the way that you put that. Had it just been a health crisis, it would have been something entirely different. But
yeah,
you know, the way that I have started to think about that is it just seems as if this is such an issue of spiritual formation, that people have been discipled by cable news, Fox News. And you know, I love the question that you asked there at the end there, and so just to try to flip that around back to you. Is there a way that you are, having seen that, the importance, the place that politics has kind of shaped people,
Mm.
is there a way that you look at that and you think, wow, this is changing the way that maybe we think about discipleship, maybe the way that, we, do discipleship, since
Sure.
people are being discipled? What are your thoughts on that?
Gosh, I hope I'm not the only one who got their clock cleaned a little bit,
Yeah.
got humbled a little bit, and came away going, okay, we got work to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I knew that there were people who were more driven, politically than I was, and more watched, cable news more than I did. I had no idea,
Mm.
what I could have never predicted what I've seen, not just in our church. I mean, across rural small towns, and especially in America, um, and I think, I've wondered a lot of stuff, like, what, you can't help but think, what could I have done better? I mean, um, did I overswing the pendulum in trying not to talk about politics? Did I overswing the pendulum and not talk about, like, the nature of the political nature of the gospel, which is we have a king and a kingdom, and what it means to, like, see that as your primary citizenship? I mean, should I have done that more? I mean, you can't help but sort of think back, but yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, man, we're really kind of going back to square one on our discipleship stuff. We're
Mm.
trying to think through, I mean, how can we say this happened again? How could we help people be better prepared? How do we help equip? That's all we can do, is equip people. How could we better equip people to have a mindset where they were more quickly able to discern, you know, where their heart may be wandering off, away from Jesus toward another gospel. And we're actually preaching through Hebrews right now, and that was intentional because, you've got this church that's divided and distracted and whatever, and the preacher he continually holds out Jesus again and again and again, going, I mean, I think really if he's like this, well, we surely can't act like that. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
what is it like to live in light of how good he is? I mean, really, it's holding up how good Jesus is. That's our strategy right now, is we got to, like, put front and center every single opportunity. Here's how good Jesus is. And that's, you don't have to just say sin is bad or that is bad. I think, but when you say how good Jesus is, he casts shade on everything, makes everything look pale, And so that's the strategy we're after right now, is just holding up Jesus as clearly as we can, knowing that will mean, everything else should be seen as lesser. And then in the background, working on, okay, what are some discipleship strategies we can take in small groups or whatever that can help dig deeper wells in people so they're more prepared for something like this the next time,
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a good word. It's definitely been revealing and causing us to really examine, how are we forming, helping people be formed, Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like a Katrina situation,
Mm.
like, everyone probably thought that was okay, or most people didn't think about it. And then you didn't realize that kind of storm could happen.
Wow.
I think that's the situation that a lot of us are in small towns and rural places, is that I think we probably took for granted a lot of things because we'd never seen a storm like we just saw, and now you gotta, I mean, we get hit by hurricanes here. So, I mean, I kind of got that feeling, but, I picked, when I lost 34 trees in Florence, one on our house, and just, and I mean, it was interesting. I was nervous to plant trees again. And when I planted trees, I did so much stupid research about what trees wouldn't blow over in a hurricane, is what I was trying. I just didn't want to repeat the situation, but it never crossed my mind that it was possible that, that could happen. And, I think we've all just lived through a storm, and it's probably right to ask some questions like, okay, well, we get to rebuild now. What should we do differently? Because it could happen again.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that, and you mentioned, just to, go back to something that you referenced earlier. So you talked about online,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody had to deal with that. Small towns are not known as internet hotspots usually.
Yep.
And so everybody's talking about hybrid churches, online churches, and rural areas
Right.
may not even have stable online, period.
Right. Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
what are some dynamics here, or maybe even the way that you guys are thinking, as far as how we navigate that online space
Yeah.
as rural churches with the challenges that we have?
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, I think live feed is a real challenge because of the internet stability stuff.
Yeah.
So that one, I think, it's just interesting how so much of like what we hear about what churches should do is taken for granted that it's in like an urban or a large suburban area.
That's a
I mean,
word
even
right
like,
there.
we got to break the 200 barrier. I mean, I've heard that a bunch.
Yeah.
Well, man, if your island ain't got 200 people, you ain't going to break that 200 barrier.
Come
Or
on. Yeah.
the average size church in America is 75. Well, if your town is 200 and you have 75, that is revival.
Yeah, you're doing
You're like
great.
Joel Osteen over there. Like, you should be on the front of Outreach magazine, you know? But it's just interesting how we take our cues from like that sort of broader, more urban or suburban culture. And I think we just have to be careful with that, because how many of us are just living in this constant state of like, we're not good enough because we're not measuring up to a standard we could never, it's not possible, you know? So that said, I think we have to reformat everything we hear and think about our own community. So what we're hearing is, hey, we've got to get creative, because if you can't meet in person, you've got to still find a way to get the gospel to each other. So the real line is, we got to get creative on how do we pastor people? How do we still, Acts 20:28, pay careful attention to the flock of God among us? That's not something that's just like, oh, well, only when you can meet in person on Sunday mornings or Wednesday nights. Now, that charge to like pay careful attention is I think is a charge for all times, for all seasons. So I think the challenge is that we need to take is like, we've got to get creative. We got to think about things we haven't thought of. And so, I mean, for us, we did the live stream thing, but it was hard and it was not that stable. And we've probably got it a lot better than certainly a lot of other areas around us. And if we got any kind of a weather event, it wasn't happening. Like wind or whatever would just shut it all down. And so we would pre-record them, and that became what we did. We pre-recorded the sermons, and that's guaranteed. You got time to post it, and then they can download it and watch it, from home. I think if you're stuck in a situation where you got to go online, that is a far more, I think it's a far more feasible way to do it in small towns and rural places. And but then again, I think there's the broader dynamic of, does it really work at all as a long-term strategy? Because I think people had Zoom fatigue, our kids were staring at a TV all day, or a computer all day for school, and they might've been staring one all day for work. I don't know. They want to stare at another one on Sunday morning. I mean, I didn't.
Yeah.
I leave the church and I didn't want to look at it, So I think that's another kind of thing that we shouldn't just say, well, and we did the sermon online, so everyone watched it, so I'm sure it's just as good. So I'll tell you the other side of this, Mark, is I think we had to go and up our like calling people, pastoring side of things, like way higher than we ever have before. I mean, we basically told everybody on our staff, look, we don't have kids ministry right now, so you're going to start calling people in the church and praying for them. And we had to like take that to a whole nother level. And I think that is stuff that if I was to do this again, we'd be leaning in more. I think more about that than even like the online video stuff. I think pre-record it, post it. That's my opinion. But how do we actually pay careful attention to the flock? How do we care for them? How do we not provide general oversight, but really shepherd them?
Yeah.
That's the question, when you can't put your hands on them, we can't see them on a Sunday morning,
Yeah. Man, that's a good word. How are you, maybe for you guys or just people that you're coaching, how are you encouraging churches in small towns to think about the future? Is there anything that, hey, maybe we need to consider this, that sort of thing?
Yeah. I think we've kind of gotten at some of it. on the other side of a storm, you got to ask some questions. I mean, like, you're counting bodies, so I think that's the first part, is figuring out where have people gone, like, where are they at? Are they at another church? That's okay. Just be good to know where they're at. I bet I'm not the only one on this, watching this, who goes to bed at night wondering, well, I wonder where they are. I wonder where she is. I wonder where he is. I wonder if their marriage is okay. So I think I'm encouraging guys to, like, start thinking, this is now, I think, a good moment to start trying to get an assessment of where are people at, and then I think it's a chance to say, how are people doing? Because their back is one thing, but I'm just telling you, there are some consequences for not being in Christian community for 14 months. You just don't wander off for 14 months and everything be okay. I think what we're going to find, the pastoral weight, the amount of pastoral work we're going to find on the other side of this is going to be, I think it's going to supersede the challenges of technology and all that we've gone through the last year. I think the toll it's taken on marriages, people who were borderline alcoholics are going to be full-blown alcoholics. I mean, there's going to be all kinds. I mean, kids who were being abused at home that nobody knew about. Well, like, they were going to school and having a safe place. Now they've been home. I mean, just, there's going to be trauma. And then just the trauma of living through all this, and like, so I think we've got some real shepherding work to do. And I'm encouraging guys to think about that. Where are the sheep? How are the sheep doing? Like, that's our first and foremost. Don't get caught up in, we got to start a new site because we haven't really done anything. No, you've done everything you could do, but now you've got to figure out how these folks are doing. And so I think that's my biggest charge right now to folks is, hey, figure out where folks are at, figure out how they're doing, find ways to come alongside them. And then beyond that, from like a sort of church engineering standpoint, like I said earlier, I think we've got real discipleship work to do, and we better do some thinking and some honest assessment, and try to, like, ask the Holy Spirit to help us, give us new and better ways to equip people, because COVID might be going away, but the kind of the political divisiveness is not, and we've got to find ways to pastor people through that.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Donnie, it's been great to talk to you, man. One final question. What would you say to church pastors or just leaders? And like you said several times, they're tired, they've been through a lot, and they're just discouraged. How would you encourage them today?
Yeah, I think I just want to encourage you to say by first saying that I know what that feels like. And everybody watching this knows what that feels like. And I think it's real easy to go, gosh, I bet I'm the only one who feels like that. You're not the only one who's thought, like, what else could I do for a living? You're not the only person who's thought that. Like, you're not the only person who saw somebody cutting grass and thought, geez, I'd be better than this. At least I'd be able to, just go home at night. And, that was, you're not the only person who's fantasized about another job. You're definitely not the only person who's fantasized about, what if I was in another place? So I just want to identify with you in that, just let you know I feel like that. I feel those feelings, and it's okay to feel all that. And I want to encourage you to meet with Jesus. I've been really struck by this moment where Jesus comes back from the dead, and right away he goes and he gets his friends and he gets on a beach and he eats fish with them. And he didn't have to do that. Like, he could have just had a meeting, sit down in rows, but he sat and met with them and fed them and engaged them. And I think what we need most of all is we need to encounter Jesus afresh again. More than we need to figure out how to fix all these problems. We need to be meeting with Jesus. Like, only Jesus can encourage our hearts and souls, in a way that we really need. And so I would encourage you to first be doing that. And then I would say, I hope you've got some friends who are in ministry, who aren't in your church, who you can lean on and confide in and say, hey, pray for me. I've got a friend, Elliot Grudem, who says, that the gospel is a lot of times it's sweeter on a brother's lips than it is even my own heart. And I think what he's getting at there is really profound. It's that you and I, we know all the right answers. Like we can tell someone else the gospel, but man, when we really need to hear it, sometimes we just need to hear it from somebody else. There's something about someone speaking like the truth of like the grace of Jesus over us. And so I hope you've got some friends. If not, I think, I would be encouraging you to try to find a way, whether that's your network or denomination or whatever, but, just getting some peers you can just, be honest with how you're doing and how you're feeling and receive ministry for yourself. And then I just want to encourage you to be patient. This is not going to go away overnight. Some restrictions might lift overnight, but we've got some work to do. But Jesus is with us and we'll get through it, and somehow, some way, I think the church will be better for it. So.
Well, Donnie, this has been great, man. Thanks so much for taking the time to do it. Hey, anybody that would want to connect with you online or anything like that, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah. So, I'm on Twitter. You can find me there. I'm on Instagram and Facebook and stuff too, but most of the small town stuff I do, Twitter. And there's a website, smalltownjesus.com. I think it's getting relaunched this week. So we're redoing it. So, anyway, that's there. It's got a bunch of videos and articles and whole tons of stuff. Just me trying to help you guys figure out ways to raise up leaders or deal with addiction or whatever, in your small towns. And then there'll be a couple of events on there. I do a couple conferences a year on small town stuff, so you can check those out. There's one in Missouri this year, and there's one in Oklahoma City. I know of for sure. So those dates will be on there if you want to, meet me in person and come get encouraged and meet some other guys like yourself.
That's great. Well, we'll put all the links to that in the show notes. And Donnie, thanks for coming on today. It's been great.
Appreciate it, Mark. Thank you for having me.